Rob Liefeld is one of the most criticized artists to ever work in comics. He can't draw feet, he can't do perspective. Has he ever even seen a woman? But at the same time, he was, for a brief period, the world's most successful comic book artist. He was an actual celebrity. He made millions of dollars drawing comic books. How did someone who apparently has no skill in drawing become so successful and so popular? What was the secret to his success? And why did everyone turn on him? I've spent the last few weeks researching, and the answer I found was probably the last thing that I expected. Let's start with something you've probably never seen before, a Rob Liefeld drawing with feet. Here's another. There's some wonky proportions here and there, but before you go dunking on him, here's the thing. He did these drawings as a teenager. These drawings are from a portfolio that he had put together at 19 years old to try and get a job in comics. They would have been tucked under his arm at WonderCon 1987, standing in a long line waiting for his turn to show them to an editor from Marvel Comics.
Well, the head editor for Marvel says that sometimes he discovers new artists at the conventions.
Hundreds of them show up at every convention, hoping that this will be their big chance.
And unlike everyone else in line, this might be his only chance. You see, when Liefeld was young, his dad was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Over the next few years, Liefeld's father would be in and out of medical care, spending 9 months in a coma, losing an eye, and the medical costs would cripple his family financially. But something came out of that experience for young Rob Liefeld, because sitting all those hours alone in a hospital waiting room, on his lap would be a comic book. And this was the 70s, when comic book art in America was exploding. George Perez, John Byrne, Neil Adams, and so many others were revolutionizing the medium. I can only imagine how necessary it must have been for a kid whose family is going through this traumatic experience to be able to escape that reality and into the universes of DC and Marvel. So comics become his obsession, as does, soon after, drawing. But despite his obvious natural talent, there was no way his family could afford to send him to art school. He was working 3 jobs to support them and just drawing in whatever time he had left over. And now, his father's tumor had come back. If he wanted to continue drawing at all, he'd need to be getting paid for it. This portfolio review meant everything to him. So he finally gets to the front of the line and sets his pages down before legendary Marvel editor Mark Gruenwald. Gruenwald shuffles through Liefeld's pages. He looks up. "Welcome to Marvel Comics," he says. "You're hired." At 19 years old, Rob Liefeld became a professional comic artist. He does a few small jobs for Marvel and DC before finally getting his shot at a regular series, DC's Hawk and Dove. It's not exactly a prestigious job, but he's desperate to make this new career work, so he brings his A game to these D-list characters. And now, it may be hard to see today why it stands out. It's obviously tame compared to the stuff we'll be looking at in a little bit, but when you compare it with other comics coming out in the late 80s, I think you'll see it's got this energy, a dynamism, and intensity that kind of makes it stand out. There were only a few other guys at this time doing this kind of showy work. One of the most influential was Todd McFarlane. And McFarlane had just been promoted at Marvel from his breakout work on The Incredible Hulk to The Amazing Spider-Man, one of the highest profile jobs in comic books. I think looking at this, you can see the influence that McFarlane was having on Liefeld right at the start, moving away from that classic house comic style into something that's a little more intense and heavy. And for young Liefeld, it's working. Hawk and Dove becomes a big success. And so, in 1988, after so many years of attending San Diego Comic-Con as a fan, Liefeld gets to go as an honest-to-God professional comic book artist. And it's at this Comic-Con where he meets someone who will change the course of his life. One of his friends introduces him to this intense Canadian guy in a jean jacket with a curly mullet. "You're Rob Liefeld," he says. "I know you. You're doing Hawk and Dove." It's Todd McFarlane. Todd McFarlane knows who Rob Liefeld is. They actually become fast friends. They end up spending the next 12 hours together, talking comics and art and everything else, even though they're at different points in their life. McFarlane is older, married, and serious. Liefeld is 20 years old and hungry for success, hungry to make the money to pull his family out of their financial situation. And what I see is this kind of big brother, little brother relationship forms between them. I mean, just check out this video they made a few years later. I think you can see the dynamic at play.
And the other biggest question that I get is, did you pay for that haircut?
Unfortunately, I did, yeah.
That's brutal, buddy.
Sorry about that.
He brags that while Liefeld is still figuring out posing and anatomy, he's busy drawing every brick on every building, adding extra girders, working to set himself apart from everyone working in comics. But Liefeld wants to set himself apart too, to catch up with McFarlane. And so, in issue 5 of Hawk and Dove, when the characters enter an alternate dimension, he has the entire book turned sideways, without getting the writers or editors' permission. Well, that didn't go over so well at DC. When they got the pages, his editor called him, furious. He demanded that Liefeld redraw the pages in a traditional format, and if he didn't, he would be fired from the book. Liefeld refuses because, unbeknownst to everyone, he had been negotiating a deal to go over to Marvel Comics. See, Bob Harras, an editor at Marvel, had recently taken over the X-Men family of books. Harras had gotten that job because a few years earlier he'd boosted the sales of the Incredible Hulk by taking a chance on a little-known artist. That artist's name was Todd McFarlane. Now, Harras was looking for the next Todd McFarlane to boost the sales of a struggling X-Men spin-off called New Mutants. Rob Liefeld was going to be his next Todd McFarlane. And, just like he had on Hawk and Dove, Liefeld attacks the assignment with everything he's got. This is an era when a book selling well meant big royalties for its creators, so his family's well-being was on the line here. He doesn't just want this book to sell well, he has to get this book to sell well. And so almost immediately after coming on the book, he begins introducing new characters, and they do not look like characters in any other comics at the time. And I'm just gonna say it, Rob Liefeld is a strong character designer. Hold on, don't unsubscribe yet, let me explain. I know he's mocked now for his pouches and shoulder pads and guns and swords, but again, we have to look at this in the context of the time. Most superheroes were square-jawed guys who wore spandex. Just look at the covers before and after Liefeld takes over. This thing is gonna stand out on shelves. He looks like he's about to murder the rest of the New Mutants. And this cover is McFarlane inking Liefeld's pencils, by the way. They're just so in sync. They spend a ton of time on the phone together as they work, and it almost seems like they're in a competition to one-up each other with how many lines they can put on a page. And Liefeld begins introducing new characters in almost every issue of New Mutants. If he's competing with McFarlane, in this area, he's winning. While McFarlane co-created Venom, most of his work on Spider-Man was really focused on creating great new visual interpretations of older characters. But Liefeld is throwing in new wild designs all the time, and the New Mutants is going from a struggling comic book to a sales success. But then McFarlane takes things a step further. He gets the assignment to launch a new Spider-Man series that he won't only draw, but also write. Whether to keep up with McFarlane because his ego was growing, or because he was genuinely trying to make the book better, Liefeld starts ignoring the scripts he's been given on New Mutants. This forces Louise Simonson, who's an incredibly gifted writer, to do last-minute rewrites around Liefeld's art. And, unlike his editors at DC, Bob Harras supports him in this. So eventually, Simonson is pushed off the book and replaced by Fabian Nicieza, who is happy to work his dialogue around Liefeld's art. And so at this point, the book just goes full Rob Liefeld. He introduces Domino, Deadpool, Shatterstar, this guy, that guy. It's just pure insanity, even if the plots and characters are getting thinner and thinner. And it's during this time that McFarlane's Spider-Man #1 finally hits the stands, and it becomes the best-selling comic book of all time. Marvel had thrown all their resources, all the gimmicks, everything they had at it. Todd McFarlane is now the biggest comic book artist in the world, and Rob Liefeld wants that. Even though he's supporting his family as an artist, just as he's always dreamed, he's still hungry for more. He wants to beat Todd McFarlane.
But our pages are actually 10 by 15, which is about the size of Rob's ego, although Bob Harras says it's usually about the size of a double-page spread.
So he calls up Bob Harras and demands he gets the same treatment, a new #1 with all the marketing resources that Marvel has. Once again, Harras is in his corner, so they cancel New Mutants with issue 100 and relaunch it a few months later as X-Force #1, with story and art by Rob Liefeld. How will it sell? We'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to use that cliffhanger to force you to listen to me talk about one other good quality of Rob Liefeld's art: his page layouts. Inspired by how McFarlane was making Spider-Man bigger and bigger in his comics, Liefeld begins to do the same.
Don't do tiny stuff. You know, that's been done a million times. Don't do tiny stuff. Todd used to beat this into me.
Characters are given huge, almost pin-up style treatment in the pages. Inspired by 80s manga like Appleseed, he works to compositionally anchor each page around key drawings. And I think this is where we start to see some of Liefeld's weird anatomy and perspective creep in.
I always start with the head and I do all these zigzags.
That's why your anatomy sucks.
That's right. Sorry.
Because while he understands how to lay out these dynamic pages, he doesn't have the fundamentals to support it, so he ends up bending bodies and reality to fit that compositional vision. And while later artists would take his bombastic approach to layouts and refine it, I can't stress enough just how innovative and groundbreaking this would have been in the early 90s. Like, if you're a kid walking into a comic book store, and a lot of the readers at this time were young kids, and you're flipping through comics and you see this, it's probably the comic you're gonna take home with you. Okay, thanks for indulging me. Back to the story. X-Force #1 finally comes out, and it beats Spider-Man #1 to become the best-selling comic book of all time. Like, this is insane. 5 years earlier, Rob Liefeld was working on a construction site. He's drawn less than 30 comics in his entire life, and he's now the best-selling comic book artist of all time. And not only are the sales good, but he's becoming an actual celebrity.
And he's all of 23 years old, and I want you to know he is one of the top talents in the comic book business. And here he is, Rob Liefeld, Hiya, Rob. Glad to have you.
Liefeld appears in a Spike Lee commercial surrounded by his X-Force characters. At 23 years old, Liefeld had achieved his original goal and so much more. But it's still not enough for him, because he's about to pull his craziest stunt yet. In the middle of his run on X-Force, this ad appears for a new independent comic, The Executioners, emphasis on the X, by Rob Liefeld. You can probably imagine the phone call he got from the Marvel executives. They threatened to sue him. They threatened to take away everything they'd given him. And so now he does something even crazier. He quits Marvel Comics. He and McFarlane, along with a few other top Marvel artists, had been plotting their escape from Marvel, so they walk out and start Image Comics. Now, I'm leaving so much out of the Image story, so much about Jim Lee, Will Sportasio, Mark Silvestri, Eric Larson. These guys all deserve their own videos, so if that's something you want, let me know down below. But the short version is, this is an absolute earthquake in the comic book universe. For McFarlane, he felt he wasn't getting the level of respect from Marvel for what he had done for them. They would use his drawings on a t-shirt or poster and not even send him one. He wanted to hurt Marvel as much as possible. For Liefeld, he saw the financial side. He saw the action figures, the t-shirts, and how much money Marvel was making off of them, and he wanted that for himself. And he's done the math. X-Force was a huge hit, and he'd only have to sell about 200,000 copies of an independent comic book to make the same amount of money off of it that he was making at Marvel. But when his Image comic Youngblood comes out, it doesn't sell 200,000 copies. It sells over 1 million copies and becomes the highest selling independent comic book of all time. And not only that, but his celebrity keeps increasing. The day Youngblood launches, he goes on the Dennis Miller Show for one of the weirdest talk show interviews I've ever seen.
Well, how old are you?
I'm 24.
Oh, wow. Well, you know, when I was young, we used to read, did you ever read Daredevil, X-Men, stuff like that?
Yeah, I work for Marvel.
And Youngblood's kind of a funny comic. For me, personally, it's the tipping point where all the fun stuff about Liefeld begins to go just too far. It seems that his success had caused him to stop trying to develop further as an artist, and he leans harder into his quirky tendencies. Like, he introduces not just one team, but two in the first issue of the book, and then in issue 2, he introduces another team and more new characters in issue 3. And those innovative, eye-grabbing layouts, well, they're becoming a problem. They may look great to flip through, but I feel they kind of harm a comic's ability to tell a story. Because while yes, Appleseed and other manga were using these big anchored images, they also surrounded them with pages and pages of rock-solid conventional storytelling. But Youngblood disposes of all of that. Issue 2 has 5 double-page splashes, 2 of which are vertical. I'll put a link down below if you want to check it out, because while it's kind of incomprehensible, it does have this raw overabundance of energy that's kind of exciting. And that energy isn't just on the page, it's spread into Liefeld's life. He gets a cushy office and starts building out a studio of artists. He wants the best and most brilliant creatives working for him and starts throwing money around like crazy. He pays double, triple the industry standard to get people to work for him. He launches more and more comics, creating characters and handing them off to his staff. He ends up with 65 employees publishing 22 comics per month. He's 25 years old and running his own comic empire. But this is where his path has diverged from McFarlane. While Liefeld is growing an empire, McFarlane has focused all of his energy onto a single property, Spawn. And Spawn becomes the big hit for Image Comics. It beats Youngblood to become the best-selling independent comic book of all time. Liefeld begins to resent McFarlane, who repeatedly insists that Spawn is more valuable and more important than the rest of the Image lineup. And while Spawn is shipping regularly, Youngblood is slipping further and further behind. Liefeld takes over a year to publish the first 5 issues, and almost another full year before issue 6 comes out. McFarlane yells at Liefeld because his inability to ship on time is giving all of Image a bad reputation with retailers. Liefeld, for his part, begins referring to McFarlane as the scolder-in-chief of Image Comics. Tensions between Liefeld and McFarlane were at a breaking point, and while I can't know what Liefeld was thinking, the next thing he does seems like it was intentionally designed to get back at McFarlane. See, since the departure of the Image artists, Marvel had been struggling with sales, just as McFarlane had hoped. There are a lot of causes of that, as the gimmicks and bad storytelling of the 90s had finally caught up with them, but now new leadership had come in and was looking for a radical way to shake things up. And so they reach out to Todd McFarlane and supposedly offer him $3 million to come back and take over some of their failing books. He turned them down point blank. Marvel was the enemy, and no amount of money was about to change his mind. But then, shortly after, he finds out that someone did take that offer. Rob Liefeld. Rob Liefeld is going to take over Captain America for $3 million. It was a clear betrayal of McFarlane's vision for Image Comics, of his desire to hurt Marvel as much as possible. Liefeld had gotten his revenge, but it would cost him. In a unanimous vote of the Image partners, he was fired, or he quit. There's some debate, sources are below. But either way, the result was a messy divorce between Liefeld and McFarlane. The man who inspired him, who became his friend, his friendly competitor, his partner in business, was now his #1 enemy. He had given it all up for this job at Marvel. Was it worth it? Probably not, because things start going wrong almost right away. Liefeld's Captain America and Marvel's whole new direction is heavily criticized. It's during this period that Liefeld produces this infamous drawing that would end up haunting him for the rest of his career. And then Marvel declares bankruptcy. Again, there's a lot of causes for that besides comic sales, and maybe that's a good topic for a future video, but what matters is that new leadership comes in and they do not like Rob Liefeld. And so, his Captain America run is cut short after only 6 issues. After giving up so much for this job at Marvel, he had now lost Marvel too. And McFarlane, bitter over their dispute, uses every opportunity to tarnish Liefeld's reputation. He says everything you need to know about Rob Liefeld is in his name. He robs, he lies, and he failed. And it works. Liefeld's reputation continues to deteriorate. Articles accusing him of swiping art, of being unable to draw, go viral. A whole cottage industry pops up of memes about his inability to draw. And the aw shucks, I'm just happy to be here persona disappears. His public persona becomes brash and confrontational. He gets into fights on social media with other creators over credit or other comments he's made. He promises new projects that take years to materialize or just never come out. To me, he seems bitter. Success had come so quickly and evaporated just as quickly. And all the while, McFarlane continues to succeed. Image becomes a huge success. McFarlane's toy business revolutionizes the action figure market and becomes a serious challenger to established toy companies. So much so that he gradually hands off more and more of the creative responsibilities on Spawn so he can focus on toys. And it's here, I think, that we find the final clue to Liefeld's secret to success. Because while McFarlane stopped drawing comics, Liefeld never did. He's still drawing comics today, drawing comics for Marvel and DC. Why? I can't imagine he needs the money, and every issue he releases just brings out more of his detractors. Because this is his real secret.
X-Men 108, John Byrne's very first issue of the X-Men. The X-Men are battling the Shi'ar off planet, and there's a cosmic disturbance that's
Rob Liefeld loves comics so much, more than almost anyone else. And for a brief period, that love made it into his work, and it was enough to overcome all of his technical shortcomings and make him a superstar. But that very success would corrupt him. It would cost him his audience, his business, his reputation, and his friendships. But the story doesn't end on a sad note. Because in the last few years, he seems to have lightened up, learned to laugh and enjoy his success, enjoy drawing comics, and most importantly, to repair some long-lost friendships.
Trust me, I meet 23-year-olds now and I go, oh my gosh, I was such a dumbass. I can't believe I was doing what I was doing.
In charge.
Yeah.
I would never put that guy in charge.
No, I mean, let me just jump to the point. I get really reflective and emotional around San Diego. I love this show. I love my memories, and I don't think there's a memory I have without this guy. Like, especially the formative years were the best. They were the craziest before we all became our own entities. It was so awesome.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can really help out by sharing it with a friend or on social media. I'll see you guys soon.